The telegram arrived at Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's headquarters in the pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944, carried by a junior staff officer whose face had gone pale with the implications of what he delivered. Von Rundstedt read the initial reports from Normandy with the weary resignation of a professional soldier who had spent 4 years watching tactical brilliance become strategically irrelevant, who understood that the massive Allied landing in France represented not a crisis to be managed, but the beginning of the end. The Allies were no longer merely threatening from multiple directions, they were now actively advancing on all fronts simultaneously, and Germany lacked the forces, the fuel, the industrial capacity, and increasingly the will to stop them. Von Rundstedt had commanded German forces in the West for much of the war, had been dismissed and recalled as Hitler's confidence in his generals waxed and waned with the fortunes of battle. He was 70 years old, an officer of the old Prussian school, skeptical of National Socialism, but bound by oath and tradition to serve the state regardless of who controlled it. Now reading reports of thousands of Allied ships disgorging armies onto the beaches of Normandy, while the Luftwaffe remained conspicuously absent and German panzer reserves sat immobilized by Hitler's refusal to release them without his personal authorization, von Rundstedt understood that the multi-front war Germany's strategic planning had always sought to avoid had become unavoidable and catastrophic. The timing could not have been worse, though in truth there was no longer a good time for Germany to face new crises. In the East, Soviet forces were preparing their summer offensive, marshaling resources for what intelligence suggested would be the largest operation yet launched on the Eastern Front. In Italy, Allied forces had finally broken through the Gothic Line and were advancing on Rome, which would fall within days. In the Balkans, partisan activity was intensifying, tying down divisions that were desperately needed elsewhere. And now in France, the Western Allies had established their long-anticipated Second Front, landing with a force and coordination that made the invasion's success increasingly probable. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations at OKW, had been tracking the deteriorating strategic situation for months, watching the colored pins on his maps chart the steady compression of German-held territory. He maintained elaborate situation reports documenting the force ratios on each front, the available reserves, the replacement rates for destroyed units. The mathematics were inexorable and terrifying. Germany was engaged on multiple fronts against enemies who collectively possessed overwhelming superiority in every category that mattered for modern industrial warfare. The Eastern Front remained the largest commitment of German forces, with over 2 million men locked in constant combat against Soviet armies that had grown progressively more competent with each passing year. The Red Army of 1944 bore little resemblance to the force that had been shattered in 1941. It had learned mobile warfare, had perfected the coordination of armor, artillery, and air power, had developed operational doctrines that could achieve breakthrough and exploitation with devastating effectiveness. Most ominously, it showed no sign of exhausting its manpower reserves or industrial capacity. General Heinz Guderian, recently appointed Inspector General of Armored Troops, had traveled the Eastern Front inspecting defensive positions and meeting with commanders. His reports to Hitler painted a grim picture of units spread too thin, of defensive lines that existed more on maps than on the ground, of panzer divisions worn down to fractions of their authorized strength. The defensive warfare that Germany had been forced to adopt after the failure at Kursk in 1943 was bleeding the Wehrmacht white, inflicting heavy casualties on the Soviets but suffering losses that Germany could not replace. Guderian's attempts to convince Hitler to adopt a mobile defense strategy, to trade space for the preservation of forces that could counterattack when opportunities arose, had been rejected. Hitler insisted on holding every meter of ground, on defending static positions that the Soviets could isolate and destroy, on committing reserves to futile counterattacks that accomplished nothing except depleting Germany's dwindling armor strength. The result was a front that was simultaneously overstretched and inflexible, incapable of preventing Soviet breakthroughs, yet unable to conduct the kind of mobile operations that might have imposed higher costs on the attackers. In Italy, the situation was equally discouraging from the German perspective. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had conducted a masterful defensive campaign for months, exploiting Italy's mountainous terrain to create defensive lines that slowed the Allied advance to a crawl. But slowing was not stopping, and each defensive line eventually fell to the combined weight of Allied artillery, air power, and infantry assault. Rome, which Hitler had declared must be held, was about to fall. Beyond Rome lay more defensive positions, more opportunities for delay, but no prospect of actually halting the Allied advance or driving them back into the sea. The forces committed to Italy represented divisions that might have made a difference in France or Russia. Troops and equipment tied down in a theater that offered no strategic opportunities, only the possibility of prolonging a defensive campaign that could not ultimately succeed. But withdrawing from Italy would expose southern Germany to invasion, would surrender territory and prestige, would make visible the retreat that was happening anyway, but could at least be disguised as an organized defensive in depth. Now, with the Normandy landings, Germany faced a third major theater requiring massive commitment of forces. The initial Allied beachhead was relatively small, vulnerable to counterattack if sufficient forces could be concentrated quickly enough, but those forces existed only in theory. The panzer divisions stationed in France were dispersed across the country, some near the beaches, but others positioned to defend against landings elsewhere. Hitler, who had convinced himself that Normandy was a feint and the main landing would come at Calais, refused to authorize the movement of reserves toward the actual invasion site. General Leo Geyr von Schweppenberg, commanding Panzer Group West, understood that the critical window for defeating the invasion was measured in hours, perhaps days at most. Every hour that passed allowed the Allies to reinforce their beachhead, to bring more men and equipment ashore, to establish defensive positions that would make dislodging them progressively more difficult. But he could not act without authorization from higher command, and higher command was paralyzed by Hitler's insistence on maintaining personal control over panzer deployments. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B and responsible for defending the invasion coast, had spent months preparing for this moment. He had inspected beaches, ordered the construction of obstacles and fortifications, positioned forces where he thought they could best respond to invasion. But his preparations had been constrained by competing strategic visions, his own belief that the invasion must be defeated on the beaches, von Rundstedt's preference for holding armor in reserve for counterattack, and Hitler's insistence on maintaining tight control over strategic reserves from Berlin. The result was a compromise that satisfied no one and created a defensive system that failed to implement anyone's strategy effectively. Beach defenses were stronger than they had been, but not strong enough to stop a determined invasion supported by overwhelming naval gunfire. Armor reserves were available, but positioned too far from the beaches to intervene in the critical first hours, yet not concentrated enough to deliver the kind of massive counterattack that might drive the Allies back into the sea once they had landed. Rommel's attempts on the morning of June 6th to get authorization for panzer movements toward Normandy were frustrated by Hitler's nocturnal schedule and the reluctance of staff officers to wake him with news of the invasion. By the time authorization came, hours had been lost, and Allied air power had made daylight movement of armored formations suicidal. German tanks attempting to reach the battlefield were bombed and strafed, their progress measured in kilometers per day rather than the rapid thrusts that might have reached the beaches while the Allies were still vulnerable. The situation reports arriving at OKW painted a picture of simultaneous crisis on all fronts. In the east, Soviet forces had launched preliminary offensives that appeared to be probing attacks, preparing for a larger operation. In Italy, Allied forces had broken through the last defenses south of Rome and were racing toward the capital. In France, the Normandy beachhead was expanding. Allied forces were linking up the separate landing zones into a continuous front, and the buildup of men and materiel was proceeding faster than German intelligence had thought possible. General Walter Warlimont, Jodl's deputy at OKW, attempted to calculate the force requirements for stabilizing all three fronts simultaneously. The numbers he produced were simultaneously precise and useless. Germany needed forces it did not possess, could not raise, and could not supply even if they somehow materialized. Every division sent to France was a division unavailable for the Eastern Front. Every tank committed to Italy was one less for the defense of France or Russia. Every aircraft diverted to contest Allied air superiority in the West was one less to support the Eastern armies. Field Marshal Hugo Spurley, commanding Luftflotte 3 in France, understood that he could not provide the air support that German ground forces required to contain the Normandy invasion. His forces were outnumbered by margins that made effective resistance impossible. Allied fighters swept the skies clear of German aircraft. Allied bombers struck at German positions with impunity. Allied reconnaissance aircraft provided their ground forces with near-perfect information, while German ground commanders operated in comparative blindness. The Luftwaffe's failure was not primarily due to pilot quality or aircraft design. German fighters remained technologically competitive, and German pilots, when they could reach Allied formations, often fought with skill and determination. The failure was quantitative and logistical. There were too few aircraft, insufficient fuel to keep them operational, inadequate replacement capacity for losses, and the progressive destruction of the infrastructure that supported air operations. Quality could not compensate for disparities in quantity of this magnitude. By mid-June, the strategic situation had clarified in ways that made its hopelessness undeniable to anyone willing to see clearly. In the east, the Soviet summer offensive had begun in earnest, Operation Bagration, the destruction of Army Group Center. Soviet forces attacked with over 2 million men, over 4,000 tanks, preceded by artillery barrages that exceeded anything the Germans had experienced. The Wehrmacht's defenses, thinned by the need to send reinforcements west to France, collapsed with shocking speed. General Georg Hans Reinhardt, commanding 3rd Panzer Army as part of Army Group Center, watched his forces disintegrate under the Soviet onslaught. Entire divisions were encircled, communications networks were shattered, the front dissolved into pockets of resistance that were systematically reduced. He sent increasingly desperate messages to OKW requesting permission to withdraw, to establish new defensive lines farther west, to save what could be saved before everything was lost. The responses, when they came, ordered him to hold every position, to counterattack with forces that no longer existed, to achieve the impossible through determination and will. In Italy, Rome fell on June 4th, 2 days before the Normandy invasion. Kesselring conducted a fighting withdrawal northward, establishing new defensive lines, buying time and inflicting casualties, but unable to stop the Allied advance. Hitler's fury at Rome's fall was matched by his inability to provide the reinforcements that might have held it. The divisions committed to Italy were locked in place, conducting a competent but ultimately futile defensive campaign, while Germany's strategic situation deteriorated on fronts that mattered more. In France, the Normandy beachhead had consolidated and was expanding. Allied forces had linked up the separate landing zones, had captured the port facilities at Cherbourg despite German efforts to destroy them, and were building up forces for the breakout from the Bocage country. German forces fighting in Normandy were demonstrating the tactical competence that had always characterized the Wehrmacht, counterattacking skillfully, making the Allies pay dearly for every kilometer gained. But they were fighting against impossible odds. General Friedrich Dollmann, commanding 7th Army in Normandy, reported to Rommel that his forces were being ground down by constant Allied pressure, by artillery bombardments that never seemed to end, by air attacks that struck whenever German forces attempted to maneuver in daylight. His casualties were mounting faster than replacements could arrive. His ammunition stocks were declining because the transportation network was being systematically destroyed by Allied air power. He was fighting an attrition battle that Germany could not win. The realization that Germany was now actively fighting and losing on all fronts simultaneously spread through the officer corps with the character of a slow-motion catastrophe. Individual commanders had known their local situations were desperate, but the full picture, Soviet offensives in the east, Allied advances in the west, steady pressure in Italy, the bombing campaign destroying the industrial base, created a strategic reality that admitted no solution within the bounds of military possibility. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of OKW and Hitler's most loyal military yes-man, attempted to present this situation to the Führer in late June. He had compiled reports from all theaters, had prepared maps showing the extent of Allied advances, had calculated the force ratios that documented German disadvantage. His presentation was careful, emphasizing opportunities for counterattack and the fighting spirit of German soldiers, but the underlying message was clear. Germany was being pressed from all sides by enemies it could not defeat with available forces. Hitler's rage was characteristic. The generals were defeatists, always finding reasons why operations could not succeed rather than making them succeed through will and determination. The German soldier was superior to the mongrel Americans and subhuman Russians. It was only leadership failure that prevented victory. New weapons would turn the tide, the V-1 flying bombs that had just begun striking London, the jet aircraft entering production, the Type 21 U-boat that would regain control of the Atlantic. The wonder weapons that Hitler invoked as talismans against reality were real enough as technology, but they came too late and in too few numbers to affect strategic outcomes. The V-1 campaign against London killed civilians, but did not prevent the buildup of Allied forces in Britain or the continuing flow of supplies to Normandy. The Me-2062 jet fighter was indeed superior to Allied aircraft, but Germany could produce them only in hundreds while facing enemies who deployed aircraft in tens of thousands. The new U-boats might have been effective had they been available in 1942. But by 1944, Allied anti-submarine warfare had become so effective that even superior submarines could not overcome the quantitative and tactical disadvantages they faced. General Heinz Guderian, in his capacity as Inspector General of Armored Troops, attempted a different approach. He focused on the Eastern Front, where he had commanded and where he understood the operational realities most clearly. He argued for a strategic withdrawal to shorter defensive lines, for trading space for time and force preservation, for concentrating armor into reserves that could counterattack Soviet penetrations rather than defending static positions that would be overwhelmed. His arguments were technically sound, strategically coherent, and politically impossible. Hitler could not authorize withdrawals without admitting that the conquests of 1941 to 1942 had been reversed, that territorial gains purchased with so much blood were being surrendered. More fundamentally, Hitler's entire strategic vision was predicated on expansion, on Lebensraum, on the conquest of eastern territories for German settlement. Giving back conquered lands contradicted the ideological foundation of the Nazi project. So the orders went out to hold every position, and the Eastern Front continued to collapse in the face of Soviet offensives that were overwhelming the static defenses Hitler insisted upon. Army Group Center was being destroyed in Belarus. Army Group North was being compressed into the Baltic states. Army Group South was retreating through Ukraine, and each front's crisis competed with the others for reinforcements that did not exist.
In France, the Allied breakout from Normandy began in late July with Operation Cobra. American forces, after weeks of grinding combat in the Bocage, achieved a breakthrough south of the Cotentin Peninsula and began racing across France with the kind of mobile warfare at which the Wehrmacht had once excelled. German forces holding forward positions, as Hitler demanded, found themselves outflanked and encircled. The Falaise pocket would trap much of the German Seventh Army, destroying it as an effective fighting force. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who had replaced von Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief West after von Rundstedt's blunt assessment that the war was lost had earned his dismissal, found himself trying to manage a catastrophe with insufficient forces and contradictory orders from Berlin. He was to hold territory and conduct mobile defense, to preserve forces and counterattack aggressively, to defend everywhere and concentrate nowhere. The impossibility of these directives led to paralysis, to forces being committed piecemeal, to opportunities being missed while authorization was sought from Hitler. Von Kluge would soon be suspected, probably falsely, of involvement in the July 20th assassination plot against Hitler. Recalled to Berlin and facing arrest, he would commit suicide rather than face the kind of show trial and torture that had befallen other conspirators. His death was symbolic of the impossible position in which German commanders found themselves, trapped between military reality that demanded flexibility and a command system that permitted only obedience to orders increasingly divorced from reality. By August 1944, the strategic situation had deteriorated beyond the point where any military solution was possible. In the east, Soviet forces had destroyed Army Group Center, had advanced hundreds of kilometers, and were approaching the borders of Poland and the Baltic states. In the west, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France toward the German border. In Italy, Allied armies were advancing through the Gothic Line. On all fronts, German forces were retreating, fighting skillfully in tactical engagements, but unable to prevent the steady loss of territory. The generals who studied their maps in August 1944 understood that they were watching the Third Reich's death by 1,000 cuts. There would be no single decisive battle that ended the war, no dramatic breakthrough that led to immediate collapse. Instead, Germany would be compressed from all sides, its territory systematically liberated or conquered, its armies destroyed through attrition, its industrial base obliterated by bombing, until organized resistance became impossible. Some generals, the more realistic ones, began thinking about endgame scenarios, how to preserve some semblance of military organization as the Reich collapsed, how to protect German civilians from the vengeance of invading armies, how to position forces and make decisions that might influence occupation policies. These were not questions of victory, but of managing inevitable defeat in ways that might preserve something of value from the wreckage. But such thinking was dangerous in a regime where loyalty was demanded, even when loyalty meant marching into the abyss. The July 20th plot had made clear what happened to officers who tried to remove Hitler from power. The purges that followed eliminated or intimidated anyone who might have provided alternative leadership. The generals who remained were those who would obey, who would implement impossible orders, who would preside over Germany's destruction because the alternative was personal destruction at the hands of the SS and Gestapo. General Jodl,
preparing his situation reports for Hitler in late summer 1944, found himself in the position of documenting catastrophe while maintaining the pretense that it could be overcome. His maps showed Allied advances on all fronts, showed the shrinking perimeter of German control, showed the impossible force ratios and the declining combat effectiveness of German units. But his verbal briefings emphasized local counterattacks and tactical successes, minimized the strategic implications of territorial losses, and maintained the fiction that new offensives and wonder weapons would somehow reverse the tide. This was not dishonesty in any simple sense. Jodl was not lying about facts. He was framing those facts in ways that Hitler might accept, presenting information in a sequence and emphasis that avoided triggering rage that would prevent any communication at all. It was the communication strategy of subordinates in a totalitarian system where telling the truth directly meant being dismissed or worse, where influence could only be maintained by appearing to share the leader's delusions while trying to inject small doses of reality around the margins. The result was a command system that could not adapt to strategic reality because acknowledging that reality was treated as ideological betrayal. Germany continued fighting on all fronts simultaneously because admitting that this was impossible would require admitting that the war was lost. Forces continued being committed to hopeless defenses because authorizing withdrawals would validate the arguments of the defeatists. Resources continued being divided among competing priorities because concentrating on any one front would mean accepting defeat on the others. By autumn 1944, as German generals watched Allied forces advancing from east and west, as they read reports of cities being destroyed by bombing, as they tallied casualties that could not be replaced and equipment losses that exceeded production, they understood that they were presiding over Germany's military death. The Allied advances on all fronts would continue, the ring would tighten, and eventually Soviet and Western forces would meet somewhere in the heart of Europe, likely in the ruins of the Third Reich itself. The question was no longer whether Germany would be defeated, but how long the dying would take and how many would die in the process. And to that question, trapped between impossible orders from above and impossible situations on the ground, Germany's generals had no answer except to continue fighting, continue obeying, continue managing catastrophe until the catastrophe managed itself into complete and final collapse.